At 4:30 on the dark, stormy morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons pierced the blackened sky with fire and lead. From the Confederate shores of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, the soldiers of the new Confederate States of America rained a tempest of exploding shells, gunshot, and cannonballs upon Union troops holding the Federal Island fort called Sumter. The American Civil War had begun. All through that day and night, both Union and Confederate cannons roared. By dawn the next day, much of Sumter was ablaze. Smoke filled the air, and inside the lower levels of the fort, many men fought just to breathe. From atop Sumter's walls, the Union flag still waved, though its staff had been hit 9 times. Then suddenly the lookout cried, "The flag is down!" In an act of daring, Police Sergeant Hart climbed the walls of Sumter. With bursting shell and smoke everywhere, he grabbed a hatchet and nailed the battered flag into the wall. For a moment, Old Glory would wave proudly. But after 34 hours of bombardment, the Federal troops were finally forced to surrender the fort. Sumter now belonged to the Confederacy. By June 1861, the southern states of Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia had all joined with South Carolina, declaring their own new government. Now the Confederate States of America had the resources of a total of 11 states. During the Civil War, these states were often referred to as the Confederacy, or the South. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri, also referred to as border states, continued to use slave labor, yet remained loyal to the United States of America. Their resources, joined with the other states, brought the total of states loyal to the United States to 23. These states were often referred to as the Union, or the North. The following is a comparison of the Confederate and Union resources and positions. Jefferson Davis was chosen as the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. Newly elected President Abraham Lincoln, considered one of the most skilled political leaders in American history, led the Union. The Southerners fought to establish a separate country. They felt the federal government did not recognize their states' rights. Therefore, these states seceded or withdrew themselves formally from the United States. To them, this was a war of independence. The Confederacy had 9.5 million people total. 5.5 million were white, and 4 million were African slaves. The Union had a total population of 22 million. Northerners were willing to fight to keep all states together and to defend the Constitution. The Union did not recognize the Confederate States of America as a separate government, and regarded the South as a loose alliance of rebellious states within the United States. 2,100,000 Northern men joined the military during the course of the war. There was a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers for the Union over the South. Southern manpower totaled around 800,000. They had no pre-war army. The South built its fighting forces around the already existing state militias. The Confederacy had a total of 18,000 manufacturing companies and only one foundry capable of manufacturing a railroad locomotive. The Union had a total of 110,000 manufacturing companies. They could easily produce railroad engines, cannons, rifles, and ironclad ships. The Confederacy had around 9,000 miles of track. Most of the railroads were situated in the states of Virginia and Tennessee. The Union had a total of 23,000 miles of track. This was a key factor in the Union's ability to successfully transport supplies to its armies. Most of the wealth of the Confederacy was in the land and slaves. Money was in short supply, and there were few banks. 81% of the United States banks were in the North, establishing the wealth necessary for financing a war. In the Confederacy, the institution of slavery was legal and protected, though some did not accept it. In the Union, slavery was legal, but not unanimously acceptable. On April 19, 1861, President Lincoln put the Union battle plan into effect. The plan, known as the Anaconda Plan, would cut the South off from itself and eventually put a stranglehold on the Confederate Empire. This plan consisted of three main parts. First, the Union Navy would blockade all Confederate ships from leaving or entering Southern territory. Second, the Union troops would attempt to infiltrate and dominate the Mississippi River, thus cutting the Confederate Empire in half. Third, Lincoln also targeted the capture of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. To defend itself, the South would have to break the Union blockade near their seaports and protect their coastline. The newly formed Confederate government would also seek out the help from other governments, such as France and Britain. Hopefully, these European countries would be influenced by their need for the South's cotton. In 1861, most of the cotton in the world was grown in the South. And finally, the South knew they could win the war if they could capture the Union capital, Washington, D.C. Neither the North nor the South was fully prepared for the war. Initially, both sides went to war thinking it would be a short conflict. Lincoln called for Union volunteers for only 90 days. Many proud Southerners boasted that the war would be over in 2 months.
Well, we figure this here war won't take more than a couple of months. We figure we can whip them Yankee boys and be back in time for the cotton harvest. We know them Yankee boys don't know how to shoot, and we're going to show them what for.
Housing, training, and dressing the thousands of troops was a great task. Camping outdoors was new for most. Many of the volunteers had never fired a gun in battle, or were prepared for the hardships of Army life. After much trial and error, the official uniform color for the Union was blue, and the official uniform color for the Confederacy was gray. For weeks, the United States Capitol lived in fear of Southern invasion. Northern citizens and statesmen pleaded for action. With war now a reality, Union troops marched on to Richmond. One of the first battles between the newly trained armies was at the small town called Manassas, near a peaceful stream called Bull Run. It was a hot Sunday, July 1861. Expecting the Union troops to crush the rebel forces, politicians and other Washingtonians traveled to the battle site for a picnic and a quick victory. 20,000 Confederate troops under the command of the experienced General P.G.T. Beauregard waited for the approaching Union troops. The Union artillery sent the first shot across Bull Run. A battle of confusion and chaos was underway. Led by the inexperienced General Irvin McDowell, the 32,000 Yankees successfully hammered the rebel troops. McDowell called out,
"Victory! Victory! The day is ours!"
But as the day wore on, more and more Confederate troops had arrived at the center of the battle. By 3:30 p.m., 20,000 Confederate troops under General Stonewall Jackson prepared to attack the Union troops.
Hold your fire, boys, until they are on you. Then fire and give them the bayonet. And when you charge, yell like furies.
As the Confederate troops surged forward at the Union forces, they gave out a strange and eerie battle cry that would come to be known as the Rebel Yell. Within 15 minutes, massive chaos broke out among the Union line. Thousands of Union soldiers threw down their weapons in packs. Union troops began to scatter everywhere and run for their lives. The bold rebels managed to turn the tide of the battle to their favor. By nightfall, what was left of McDowell's Union Army, plus the thousands of terrified onlookers, were all fleeing headlong back to Washington. With 2,708 Union and 1,982 Confederate troops killed, wounded, and missing, the First Battle of Bull Run was then the largest and bloodiest battle in U.S. history. But the worst was yet to come. After the Battle of Bull Run, the need for better trained troops was most important. Discipline, respectful obedience, and skill in the use of weapons were the orders of the day. Some of the tedious exercises practiced were learning to do turns, close formation drills, and proper handling of arms. Here, a new recruit is instructed on how to load, aim, and fire his musket, which was the most important item in a soldier's equipment.
Into the breech. Just the end of it.
Most of the soldiers were aged 19 to 21 and came from farms. The youngest soldier was 9 years of age, and the oldest was 80. Though the heritages of many of these soldiers came from American families of European descent, such as the Irish, Norwegian, German, and French, there were also Mexican Americans and Chinese Americans serving. Native Americans also served in both the Union and Confederate sides. And later in the war, black Americans, known as the colored troops, fought honorably, though were first discriminated against with less pay than white soldiers of the same rank, menial jobs, and poor equipment. During the war, each side nicknamed the other. Johnny Reb referred to Confederate soldier, and Billy Yank for a Union soldier. Army life was hard and very different than most soldiers expected. They lived in basic shelters such as canvas tents, log huts, and bomb-proofs, which were large holes in the earth with the roof about a foot above the ground. Homesickness, foul weather, filth, impure water, crime, and a lack of privacy made camp most intolerable. The average soldier's diet was of salt pork, beef, bread, cornmeal, beans, and coffee. Oftentimes the food was rotten. Soldiers often complained about the food.
Now, I wouldn't say this to anyone but you, Sergeant, but between us, since the men aren't around, this food is lousy. This hardtack, these things are called worm castles by the men because that's what they grow, worm castles. But imagine if you break them up over your coffee, the worms will fall in. You just scoop them out with your spoon. They doesn't change the taste of the coffee at all.
Boys, there's no fire. Me and Billy, we're going to have a trade. Hold your fire.
Because of severe shortages in both Union and Confederate camps, the Johnny Rebs and Billy Yanks sometimes called a truce to trade goods across enemy lines.
All right, on the count of three. All right? 1, 2, You know we'll be coming for that.
Boys, over here.
The worst enemies of both the Union and the Confederacy were invisible. The biggest killers were measles, pneumonia, and most of all, dysentery. These diseases spread rapidly under uncleanly conditions. More men died of disease than in battle. Over 6 million cases of sickness were reported in the Union Army alone. Most Civil War doctors were well trained and did remarkably well for that time. Yet in the 1860s, methods of proper sanitation and causes of disease were not yet known. Many soldiers feared getting sick in their own camps more than getting shot in battle. Hospitals, doctors, and supplies were in short supply during the war years. crude makeshift field hospitals were sometimes only a mile behind the battle lines. Surgeons toiled many long hours to save those brutally injured in battle. And because of the accuracy and greater range of the new weapons, both sides suffered many thousands of needless casualties. Those wounds affecting the arms and legs often resulted in amputation. Head or gut injuries were usually fatal. And since the need for sterile procedures was not understood, the resulting infections were often more deadly than the wounds that caused them. Yet, life was not all bad. During the tiresome long periods between the constant drilling or battles, soldiers passed the time writing letters and reading those from their families and loved ones. They sang songs and were entertained with foot-stomping melodies. Many played cards, and some read, and a few had an occasional swim. Of course, there were those who got into trouble by drinking too much liquor, disobeying orders, and gambling their pay.
Take a look at that cavalry officer up yonder in the hill. Isn't he got a very
Wait a minute. You just slid a car on him. What are you trying to cheat me? Let's see what he's got there. Pull his card.
Drag them all.
Have him march about the field.
Do the rogues march a bit. Leniency. Please.
Lieutenant, a few more minutes in the sun and he'll have second thoughts. Of all people to cheat your own messmate.
Deal off the bottom of the deck now. You're just Come on, cheat, laugh now, will you? Come on, Patty, strike for your country. Yeah, you're right.
But first and foremost, most of the soldiers had a sense of duty to their flag and their country. Men begged for the privilege of carrying their regimental colors and were quick to storm into a shower of bullets and shell. The courage, sacrifice, and responsibility of the valiant Johnny Rebs and Billy Yanks are a credit to our nation. After the Confederate victory at Bull Run, President Lincoln was now more determined than ever to press the war against the South. Lincoln replaced General McDowell with the superb organizer and ambitious George B. McClellan and put him in charge of the Army of the Potomac. During the early months of the war, most of the activity took place in the East. However, during late 1861 and early 1862, the focus of action shifted to the west of the rugged Appalachian Mountains. It was there that the North would win its first major victories. Northern citizens grew restless with the war effort, and Lincoln knew he needed a decisive victory to maintain popular support of the Union cause. Though McClellan had been doing a fine job in getting the troops ready, it wasn't enough. Lincoln wanted them to win battles. One of Lincoln's other generals, Ulysses S. Grant, had a plan that was bold and straightforward. He knew that the southern defensive line, which stretched from the Cumberland Gap in the east to the banks of the Mississippi River in the west, was severely undermanned. To hold it, the Confederate commander, General Albert Sidney Johnston, had over 40,000 troops, many of whom were untried in combat and woefully under-equipped. It was obvious to Grant that the key to military success west of the Appalachians was control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. These provided perfect routes along which Federal troops could move into Tennessee, Kentucky, northern Mississippi, and Alabama. To protect these vital waterways, the Confederates built two defensive works, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. These would be Grant's first targets. And so early in February of 1862, Grant began his drive. His first objective was the weaker of the two Confederate works, Fort Henry, located on the Tennessee River. As envisioned by Grant, the campaign would be a joint Army and Navy operation. As things turned out, the Union Navy gunboats rained such a devastating hail of shot and shell upon Fort Henry that its defenders struck their colors before Grant's infantry arrived on the scene. After a brief pause, Grant pushed on against his next target, Fort Donelson, perched high on the bluffs overlooking the Cumberland River. The Confederates, realizing Grant's overwhelming superiority, soon surrendered. When the Confederate commander asked Grant for the terms of surrender, Grant replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Grant soon became the North's newest hero, and the papers christened him Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant continued his drive into the South, and by the end of March he had reached Shiloh in southern Tennessee. There, near the banks of the Tennessee River, Grant halted his drive to wait for reinforcements. The Confederate commander, Albert Johnston, seized the opportunity and in a bold plan moved against Grant and caught the Union troops by surprise. On that morning of April 6, 1862, from out of the woods a hailstorm of Confederate troops charged at the surprised Union Army. As the day wore on, it appeared that the Confederate forces would finally crush Grant. But, as fate would have it, that afternoon the Confederate General Johnston was mortally wounded by a stray bullet. Johnston's second-in-command, P.G.T. Beauregard, immediately suspended the Confederate attack, thinking a Confederate victory was assured. Beauregard spent the night regrouping his forces to prepare for their final attack the next day. But that night, as a soft rain fell, thousands of Union reinforcements arrived. The next morning, Grant unleashed a brutal counterattack. Grant's ground troops, along with a constant barrage of artillery from Union gunboats, proved too much for the Confederates. Soon, the Confederates were overwhelmed and forced to retreat to Corinth. The price in human pain and death was staggering on both sides. 13,000 Union troops were either wounded, missing, or dead, and another 10,000 Confederates suffered casualties. With no navy, the Confederate government immediately set out purchasing ships from Europe and converted them for war service. In 1862, a sunken Federal ship called the Merrimac had been raised and rebuilt with 3-inch iron plating. The rebels christened her the CSS Virginia. During her first attack, the Virginia burned one Union ship, sank another, and drove a third aground. The Northern Navy had their own ironclad ship, the Monitor, and was prepared to surprise the Virginia with their revolutionary naval design. For about 3 terrible hours, the Monitor and the Virginia battled near Hampton Roads, Virginia. Their shot, shell, canister, musket, and rifle balls flew about, striking the other with little damage. Neither vessel emerged as a clear victor, but they completely changed warfare on the water. This battle led the Union to invest heavily in the construction of more ironclad ships. With limited resources, the South's engineers and commanders devised novel methods in fighting the offensive forces of the Union naval blockade. Their strategies included attacking northern merchant vessels on the high seas, blockade running, floating torpedoes and mines, as well as propelling clumsy submarines and semi-submersibles under the seas.
20 degrees starboard, Mr. Jones. Full speed ahead.
Early in the war, the Union blockade had proved effective. The South was not completely cut off from the rest of the world, but the blockade was seriously hampering the South's struggle to obtain much-needed supplies and money from Europe. In April of 1862, Union Admiral David G. Farragut and his fleet of warships set out towards the South's greatest seaport, New Orleans. To reach New Orleans, Farragut would have to destroy the remaining Confederate strongholds at the mouth of the Mississippi. From their position offshore, Farragut's fleet rained a hail of cannonade upon the Confederate river forts, just 90 miles from New Orleans. But after 5 days of constant bombardment, with almost 17,000 rounds of mortar fired, the Confederate forts remained. Finally, with great daring, Farragut sailed up the Mississippi River past the Confederate forts which protected New Orleans. A massive exchange of fire between Union ships and the Confederate forts lit the sky. One officer said, "It seemed like all the earthquakes in the world and all the thunder and lightnings were going off at once." Eventually, Farragut emerged victorious and New Orleans fell. Soon afterward, Farragut crushed the major Confederate defenses in the remaining key river cities of Baton Rouge and Natchez. Now, the only Confederate stronghold left in the West was that of Vicksburg. Though that city did not fall until a year later, by that summer of 1862, the Confederacy west of the Appalachian Mountains had almost been totally crippled. The successive Union victories on land in the West, combined with Farragut's naval victories over key Mississippi River cities, created the sought-after split in the Confederacy. Though other battles were yet to be fought in this Western theater, the outcome of the war would now be settled in the East. On March 18, 1862, an army of over 90,000 Union soldiers under the command of General McClellan started moving toward Richmond. Known as the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan's plan was to take the Union forces to Fortress Monroe, and from that point to reach Richmond up the peninsula between the James and York Rivers. By taking this route, he could have the support of his Navy. Lincoln only consented to the plan on the condition that 40,000 troops remain in Washington to guard the Union capital. As the spring rains turned the gentle streams into raging rivers, McClellan knew his advances would be slow. The Union troops would have to build bridges and mile after mile of log roads to cross the muddy terrain. By the end of May, McClellan was just miles from Richmond. The Confederates, under General Johnston, had put all their effort into reinforcing their defenses around and in Richmond, and now had a force of almost 70,000 men. On May 31st, 1862, Confederate General Joseph Johnston could see Union forces had been split in two by the rain-soaked Chickahominy River. Johnston seized the opportunity and fell upon the part of McClellan's army south of the river at Fair Oaks. In a bloody battle, the Union troops were driven almost a mile back. Union reinforcements came from across the Chickahominy River, and the ground was regained the next day. When General Johnston was severely wounded during the battle on June 1st, General Robert E. Lee became the new Confederate commander of the Army of Virginia. The strong resistance had all but halted the Union advance. In addition, 3 weeks of bad weather followed, and Union troops were forced to wait it out. McClellan had the superior force, outnumbering the Confederates almost 2-1. Time was on the Union side. Lincoln soon lost his fears of a Confederate invasion of the Union capital and sent more troops from Washington under General McDowell to reinforce McClellan's attack. In order to create a diversion and draw McDowell's troops away from proceeding to Richmond, the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson began a series of unexpected attacks on Union forces. Maneuvering quickly by carrying less equipment, Jackson's men were able to surprise the weighted-down Union divisions. Soon, Jackson's forces had reached Harper's Ferry. The people of Washington, D.C. feared Jackson would soon attack the capital. With that, Lincoln called for General McDowell and other Union forces in the area to return toward Washington in an effort to surround and capture Jackson's forces. Jackson began a quick retreat with McDowell in pursuit. In that 1 month, Jackson captured many Union supplies and prisoners. In addition, most importantly, he had drawn McDowell's troops so far west in the Shenandoah Valley, they were of no help to McClellan. Both General Lee and Confederate President Davis knew if McClellan were to launch a siege against Richmond, it would be successful. The Confederates knew they needed to attack the Union troops first. With amazing speed, Jackson's Confederate forces soon got out of the Shenandoah Valley, leaving McDowell far behind. By late May, Jackson was just north of Richmond and in position to support General Lee. On June 26th, General Lee ordered the divisions under A.P. Hill, Longstreet, and D.H. Hill to unite with Jackson and strike out against Union forces under Porter, which protected McClellan's right. So bold a move by Lee caused McClellan to believe there were at least 100,000 Confederates left to defend Richmond, when in reality there were only 25,000 left to defend the city. Because of this, McClellan never led a direct attack against Richmond. If he had attacked, he probably would have captured Richmond. From June 26th to July 1st, a series of bloody battles known as the 7 Days Battles ensued. The blue and the gray clashed fiercely at places which bore names like Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Chickahominy, Savage's Station, Fraser's Farm, and Malvern Hill. In the end, General Lee's forces stopped McClellan from capturing the Confederate capital, but the Confederates suffered 20,000 casualties and the Union 16,000. The 7 days battles was considered a Confederate victory because the Union invasion of Richmond was brought to a grinding halt. In frustration, Lincoln called for McClellan's troops to return to Washington. Lincoln would not have another chance to take Richmond for 3 long years. In mid-July, the Union armies under Fremont, Banks, and McDowell were consolidated into a force of 43,000 men and put under the leadership of General Pope. Pope had proven himself by winning battles in the West. He was aggressive but reckless. Early in July, Pope mobilized his Union force in front of Washington and headed southward along a line of railroad that ran to Manassas. They would eventually meet up with McClellan's troops and attack Richmond. Lee started north to crush Pope before McClellan could reach him. Lee had 80,000 men against Pope's 50,000. Lee sent Jackson on a detour via Thoroughfare Gap to sneak behind Pope's troops and approach from a town called Manassas. There, Jackson destroyed Pope's immense supply depot. At dawn on August 29th, Pope attacked Jackson's troops on the old battlefield of Bull Run. The air was peppered with bullets. More Union troops were needed, but where were they? It seemed McClellan was taking his time in arriving. The Billy Yanks fought in the smoky woods with their officers shouting and waving swords trying to hold their units together. The battle continued in confusion and bloodied violence. Plans were made that evening from both sides, yet the next morning confusion was still present. By late morning, 30,000 fresh Confederate troops under General Longstreet had arrived. They positioned themselves and blasted Union General Pope's 33,000 men. The North bravely rallied what was left of their original 60,000. Nevertheless, the Confederates virtually destroyed the Union forces. After several battles finally ending on September 1st, Pope's troops were forced to retreat back to Washington. The humiliation of the defeat forced Pope to resign his command. Upon hearing of this defeat, President Lincoln was most disappointed. Both sides suffered high casualties at this second battle of Bull Run. The Union, 13,783 men. The Confederacy, 8,681. By now, the cold realities of war had begun to sink in. Many a young man who had thought the war would be a quick adventure now realized their folly. They had seen bullets fall thick around them. They had seen the dead and the dying. The brutalness of war was taking its toll on them. They could see themselves changing. One young soldier wrote,
"I saw the body of a man killed the previous day, and a horrible sight it was. Such sights no longer affect me, for I now look on the carcass of a man with pretty much the same feeling as I would do were it a dead horse or a hog."
Sickened by the war, many soldiers on both sides were beginning to desert and go home. Everyone hoped for a quick end to the fighting. But the destructive forces of the war had been set in motion, and there would be no end to the suffering until one side emerged victorious.
Help me. Help. Please, help.
Up until September of 1862, the Confederate Army had been on the defensive, fighting on Confederate soil, defending their homelands. An invasion of Union-held Maryland would put the Confederates on the offensive. By carrying the war into the northern states, Confederates hoped the Union would soon ask for peace and that European governments would be willing to help their cause of independence. But most importantly of all, Lee's invasion in Maryland was driven by the Confederates' need for supplies. Starting in Virginia, General Robert E. Lee led his Confederate Army north until General George B. McClellan's Union forces caught him near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Seeing that he must fight, Lee took up a position on Antietam Creek, a few miles north of Harper's Ferry. At dawn on a foggy and gray day, 80,000 Union soldiers attacked 18,000 rebel soldiers. As the brutal day passed, other Confederate units rushed to the battle site and collected into a force of 40,000. One Union soldier wrote,
"Whether the regiment was thrown in disorder or not, I never knew. I only remember that as we rose and started, all the fire that had been held back so long was let loose. In a second, the air was full of the hiss of bullets and the hurtle of grape shot.
By dusk, 26,134 men lay dead or wounded. 12,400 of the dead were Union soldiers. The loss of Northern and Southern manpower was about equal, and nothing had been gained by either side. Soon Union reinforcements arrived. McClellan had intended to attack on the following morning and would have probably crushed Lee's forces. But Lee slipped away in the night and got his troops safely across the Potomac River. As the Confederates quickly retreated back to Virginia, so ended the Confederate invasion into the North. McClellan declared a Northern victory to Abraham Lincoln. With this so-called victory, President Lincoln presented an announcement that would end any foreign aid to the South: the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation proclaimed to all states in rebellion that if they did not return to the Union by January 1st, 1863, the President would free, thenceforward and forever, all slaves in their territories.
Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free.
By the end of 1862, the Civil War had raged across the U.S. for almost 2 years. From Fort Sumter, South Carolina, to Sharpsburg, Maryland, the war had taken its toll of lost lives, destroyed homes, and terrible devastation. On the home front, other problems had arisen. Northerners were beginning to lose faith in their government's ability to quell the rebellion. President Lincoln took action to strengthen the position of the Union. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln officially signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a declaration of freedom for some of the slaves.
If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act.
Technically, the proclamation only freed the slaves in the rebellious Confederate states. But there, Lincoln had little power to enforce his will. Yet, the proclamation did have an effect on the South's war effort. The South's allies, Great Britain and France, could not in good conscience support a country that believed in enslaving people. Though the nobles and the ruling class of Great Britain continued to support the South with supplies and the construction of warships, the vast majority of working-class people in England despised the idea of slavery. The inability of the South to deliver cotton to Europe during the war had cost 600,000 British to lose their jobs at the cotton mills. Many were starving. Yet, despite all these sufferings, they still supported the cause of freedom, and largely because of their actions, Britain never fully entered the war on the side of the South. Now the world knew the Civil War was for a higher cause: human freedom. The signing of the proclamation opened the door for many blacks, mostly already free Northerners and liberated slaves, to enlist into the Union Army and Navy. Though some slaves remained loyal servants to their Confederate owners throughout the war, thousands of unhappy slaves escaped to freedom when the Union troops moved through the Confederate states. In the South, some slaves worked for the Confederacy as cooks, stretcher bearers, and wagon drivers. African slaves also built gun emplacements and dug earthworks around important cities threatened by Union troops. Overall, life in the North for most of the population was very difficult. While husbands, fathers, and brothers were off to war, women were forced to take their place on the farms, in the factories, stores, and in the government offices. Women contributed to the war effort by supplying the troops with clothes and blankets, and by supervising sanitary programs, as well as working in factories manufacturing weapons and ammunitions.
Ladies, I wish to thank you for letting me address you this afternoon. I need to speak to you on a matter of most importance. I am associated with the Sanitary Commission out of New York. Now, I know the war has been going on and we have given a lot of ourselves, but we need to give more.
Though deeply concerned over the plight of their native state, most Southern women focused on the challenges the war placed upon their families and homes. 3 words sum up the Southern home: shortage, substitute, and sacrifice. Food shortages were the fault of the severely damaged railroad systems. Farmers could not transport the food quickly enough to the people without having it spoil. Women who lived on farms had to do everything, plus plant and harvest their own crops. The effects of the naval blockade forced women to invent substitutes for products located outside of the South. For sugar, thinned molasses was substituted. Crushed corn or dried sweet potato replaced coffee. Often during the war, the soldiers' families had no income to support themselves. The lack of supplies, worthless Confederate money, and shortage of medicine caused many hardships. Many families were made homeless as they escaped from the terrors of the enemy ransacking, destroying, and burning their homes. For the South, each year brought more death and destruction. Many women were reduced to exhaustion and yearned for the return of their loved ones. By the end of 1862, the Confederate forces west of the Appalachians had been completely sealed off by the Union troops, and so the focus of the war had shifted back to Virginia. Union Commander McClellan's failure to move against Lee's army had caused Lincoln to replace him with a new and inexperienced Union commander, Major General Ambrose Burnside. Once again, the Union strategy was to capture the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia.
'Tis the last rose of summer.
As Burnside's troops marched on to Richmond in December of 1862, they paused at the Rappahannock River just opposite Fredericksburg. But the pontoon bridges which Burnside needed to cross the river had not yet arrived, and all he could do was to sit quietly and wait. Burnside had lost precious time, and Lee managed to get Commanders Jackson and Longstreet in position on the opposite shore. Burnside had lost the ability to surprise the Confederates, but continued anyway with his attack. The Union troops were butchered by 75,000 seasoned and well-trained Confederate troops. When the smoke cleared, the Union had lost over 12,000 men, and the Confederates under 6,000. Confederate Major General Pickett wrote about the brave Union soldiers he fought against. If war is a necessity, and I suppose it is a very cruel one. The brilliant assault of the Irish Brigade was beyond description. Why, we forgot they were fighting us, and cheer after cheer at their fearlessness went up along our line. The Union loss at Fredericksburg, along with tension in the North over the war, drove Lincoln to reluctantly replace Burnside with General Fighting Joe Hooker. General Hooker resumed with the march to Richmond. In the spring of 1863, just miles from Richmond, at the town of Chancellorsville, Hooker's troops met up with the Confederate forces under the command of Robert Lee. Lee was vastly outnumbered by the Union troops, but he risked everything and attacked them in the open. Outnumbered better than 2 to 1, Lee rallied his forces and gambled on catching the Federals by surprise. The battle raged on for 4 days, and in the confusion, the brilliant Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot and killed by his own men. In the end, the Union Army was forced to withdraw, thus halting the 5th unsuccessful Union drive to capture Richmond. Early in June of 1863, with Confederate spirits high from the triumph at Chancellorsville, Lee began his second invasion of the North. If Lee could capture a northern city like Baltimore, or even the Union capital in Washington, perhaps they could dishearten the Northerners' stomach for the war, and even bring Great Britain and France to their side. In addition, an invasion of the North might cause Lincoln to pull Federal troops back from their relentless drive against Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Though General Hooker was given 90,000 men to stop Lee's advance, he failed, and in desperation, Lincoln appointed a 5th general to lead the Union, General George Meade. On June 16, 1863, Lee's Confederate forces crossed the Potomac River and entered Union territory. As Lee's troops marched across the Pennsylvania countryside, they seized livestock, food, and clothing from northern households. On July 1, 1863, Union and Confederate forces unexpectedly met at a place near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, called Seminary Ridge. Gettysburg would prove to be the biggest battle ever fought in American history. As the fighting ensued, all divisions close by converged on Gettysburg. By the second day, 65,000 Confederates and 85,000 Union men were in the vicinity of Gettysburg. Lee sent Longstreet and his men to capture a hill known as Little Round Top, which lay at the southern end of the Union defenses. The Union commander, Chamberlain, had only a small number of men to defend the hill. Chamberlain's men were outnumbered 10 to 1 by the Confederates. They would have to hold it on their own till more reinforcements arrived. Within 90 minutes, Chamberlain had lost almost 1/3 of the men on Little Round Top. With their ammunition almost gone, they fixed their bayonets and in a bold maneuver charged at the Confederates in a last-ditch attempt to defend the high ground. Chamberlain's men prevailed, and Little Round Top remained in Union hands. But other Union troops were in trouble. At places called Slaughter Pen and Devil's Den, the Confederate forces were thrashing the Union troops. By the end of that day, losses were heavy on both sides. Both Generals Lee and Meade knew the outcome of the battle would be decided the next day. Finally, on July 3rd, after 2 bloody days of battle, Lee would focus his troops on the center of the Union line. Meade's Union forces still held the high ground and were entrenched in the hills above Gettysburg. At 1 o'clock on July the 3rd, the Confederates opened fire with their cannons focused on the center of the Union defenses at Cemetery Ridge. In reply, 80 Union cannons fired back, and for 2 long hours, the earth rocked under the fury of the cannon's smoke and fire. Finally, as the Union fire gradually slowed, Confederate Commander Pickett said to his men, "Up, men, and to your post. Don't forget today that you are from old Virginia."
Charlie in! Dick! Hit!
what we're fighting for today. Home is over there. Or your wife. Or your sweetheart. Or your home. Who will follow me? For Virginia, forward! Forward!
As the vast column of cannon smoke lifted, 13,000 Confederate soldiers were seen advancing toward the center of the Union defense. Closer and closer they marched, under the murderous artillery fire, until the rebels broke into a double-quick march. It looked as if nothing could stop them. Finally, just a few hundred yards away, the Union Army cannons and musket fire broke loose with all their might as 11 cannon and 1,700 musket fired at once. In a furious rush, the few remaining Confederates stormed the Union line.
Yes, they're everywhere. Colonel gets shot. Keep firing, boys. Keep firing. Keep firing, boys. Keep firing. This whole line's alive with burning powder. I can't see anything. Where are we? Yes. They're everywhere. Keep firing, boys. Keep firing. Keep firing, boys.
It's over. It's over. The battle's over.
Rebecca. My sweetheart, is that you?
No, I'm Nurse Sandstrom.
Oh, wait for me, Rebecca. I'm no skedaddler. We will be married soon. As soon as the war is over. Oh, Rebecca, how sweet you look.
I'm sorry. I'm not your Rebecca. Now sit up.
Where the heck am I, miss?
You're in Gettysburg, sir.
The battle. Were we saved from defeat?
'Twas a glorious victory for the Union. The losses, I fear, are great. 3 days of terrible fighting takes its toll.
My head. Those Rebs, they fought with as much pluck as any man on earth could show.
There are so many to care for. Drink this. You must rest now.
Oh, we held them, didn't we? By golly, we held them. On the second day, they could have cut us off. But my boys held true.
I must go. I'll try to send some food soon.
On the third day, they gave us a fight on that charge toward us on Cemetery Ridge. There must have been 150 cannon converging on us for 2 hours. And then the whole Reb army came at us on the wide slope.
I must go. I must tend to the others. I hope you and your Rebecca are together soon.
Rebecca, my sweetheart. How I long to see her again.
Many of the wounded remained for months in tents at Gettysburg, tended by surgeons and nurses. Out of 90,000 Union troops, there were 23,000 casualties. Of General Lee's 76,000 Confederates, almost 28,000 were dead or injured. Crippled, the rebels escaped back into Virginia and thus ended their deepest invasion into Northern Territory. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln gave a short speech to the crowd honoring the dead of Gettysburg. As he spoke at this dedication of the National Cemetery, his words were never forgotten. He closed with,
"We here resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Gettysburg was not the only disaster the Confederacy was to suffer during July of 1863. In the West, Grant had been trying to crush a major Confederate stronghold, the city of Vicksburg. The Confederate General Pemberton was in charge of the city's defense. He wrote to Jefferson Davis and said, "I intend to hold Vicksburg to the last. I conceive it to be the most important point in the Confederacy." Day and night for 6 weeks, General Grant's Union forces had rained a terrible storm of shot, shell, and mini bullets upon the city of Vicksburg. Inside the city, food was scarce, and people's nerves were raw from the ceaseless Union bombardment. On July 3rd, one citizen of Vicksburg wrote,
"Provisions are so nearly gone. Martha says that rats are hanging dressed in the market with mule meat. There is nothing else. An officer at the battery told me he had eaten one yesterday."
On July 4th, General Pemberton's 31,000 Confederate soldiers, who had been Vicksburg's only line of defense, surrendered. Vicksburg had fallen just 1 day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. This gave Union forces complete control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy in two. For many white Northerners, the ending of slavery, also known as abolitionism, was not acceptable. Many poor Irish immigrants believed that the free blacks wanted to take their jobs and were angry that they were being drafted to fight for the Negroes' freedom. In July of 1863, at New York City, these immigrants violently reacted by torching abolitionists' houses and burning a black orphanage. Other riots occurred for the unfair practice that rich men could pay the government $300 to avoid the draft, the call to military service. The state of affairs in the North was very troubling for many, especially for President Lincoln. By the spring of 1864, the Confederacy had few ships left in its navy, and almost all of its valuable ports had surrendered. Yet Lincoln knew he needed an even more aggressive commander to crush the remaining Confederate strongholds. With that in mind, he chose Ulysses S. Grant to be the new commander of the Union forces. Under Grant, the Union continued to fight the still formidable rebel army, and once again the main effort was to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Despite ominous dangers, heavy losses of soldiers, and defeats in battles, Grant took advantage of the Union's superiority of manpower, supplies, and financial support. His strategy was to attack the Confederacy with relentless pressure and totally destroy the South's capacity to wage war. In the East, he would confront Lee's army near Richmond and try to crush it. Grant would also send out Generals William T. Sherman and Phil Sheridan to decimate what was left of the Confederate Empire. Together, this vice-like grip would eventually strangle the South. General Grant's military plans also extended to the people, homes, food, crops, and goods of the Confederacy. Termed as total war, Union leaders purposely destroyed anything in their path, with the intent that the afflicted South would be forced to surrender. In May of 1864, while Grant's forces marched through a swampy, heavily treed area of Virginia known as the Wilderness, Lee's army launched a fierce attack upon them. A series of bloody battles known as the Wilderness Campaign was to follow. During the course of the battle, the smoldering bullets had started the area ablaze. Many wounded soldiers were trapped in the fire and died in the flames before they could be rescued. After 2 days, Grant's troops had taken a horrible beating and were forced to regroup. Lee assumed that Grant would go back to Washington as the other Union commanders had often done. But this time, the aggressive Grant did not retreat. Instead, he slipped around Lee and clashed with him again at a town called Spotsylvania. In a tumultuous 8-day battle which followed, a total of almost 30,000 men were lost on both sides. Again, Grant sidestepped Lee, only to collide with him shortly after at Cold Harbor. In one 20-minute engagement, Grant lost more than 7,000 of his troops. But Grant would not accept defeat and would let nothing stop him. Grant knew that no matter how bad his losses, he could always replace his men and supplies, something Lee could not do. Grant realized he could not break through Lee's lines by attacking from the front, so he slipped south to a vital Confederate rail and communications center called Petersburg. In a series of engagements at Petersburg, Grant could not break through Lee's defenses, so Grant put Petersburg under a siege and cut them off until they were forced to surrender. Grant sent out William Tecumseh Sherman and 3 armies of 60,000 soldiers to strike out and destroy Confederate railroad and supply communications. Sherman's armies propelled out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and marched south to capture and burn down Atlanta, Georgia. Just as Sherman's troops took Atlanta, Navy Commander Farragut seized the last major Confederate stronghold at Mobile, Alabama. These 2 victories, Atlanta and Mobile, brought renewed hope to many Northerners, and in November of 1864, Lincoln won a toughly fought re-election as president. With Atlanta in ruins, Sherman set out to Savannah, and in a devastating 450-mile march to the sea, he destroyed almost everything in his path. His troops burned homes and farms, seized valuables, and destroyed food supplies as he executed Grant's policy of total war.
I will make Georgia howl,
claimed Sherman. The accounts from a former Southern slave tell the story of what it was like to be in Sherman's path.
Look, Miss Nancy, this about the biggest pumpkin we grown since the war.
Annie, I believe that's going to make a mighty fine pumpkin pie.
What's ailing you? Yankees coming. Yankees may be half a mile closer coming up South Road. Best to go tell Miss Nancy right quickly. I'll let the horses loose. We'll fetch them back after the Yankee leave. Miss Nancy! Miss Nancy! Yankees coming. Yankees coming up South Road.
Annie, I'll hide everything I can in the cellar. There isn't much time. You and Sam go stall them as long as you can.
I ain't never touched no Yankee before. What should I say?
Heavens, I don't know. Just keep him away from the house as long as you can.
Yes, Miss Nancy.
Roberts, you go find where they hid the valuables. Burnham, you come with me in the house.
I don't know what to say to you, Yankee. Miss Nancy says you best stay away from the house.
Ma'am, we're confiscating everything on behalf of the United States government. Now, if you know what's good for you, you best tell me where the white folks hid their gold and jewels.
I don't know where nothing's hid.
You do know where they hid the valuables. Now tell me.
Please don't hurt us. I'll tell you where it is. We grabbed Miss Nancy jewels and gold over yonder. What's going on in here? I was just cleaning the stable, sir.
That belonged to my great-grandmother. Have you no decency? Will you leave us nothing?
I reckon you'll take better care of that than me.
That's everything. Nothing of any value left.
Well then, burn it down.
To further cripple the South, Grant sent out General Phil Sheridan and his troops to make a desert out of Virginia's lush Shenandoah Valley, one of the South's last remaining sources of foodstuffs. General Sheridan said, "A crow flying over the Shenandoah will have to bring his own rations." To many, this policy of total destruction was unimaginable and had never before been seen. Historians often refer to the devastation of Sherman's march and Sheridan's destruction in the Shenandoah Valley as the beginning of modern warfare, or total warfare. Grant himself focused on defeating Lee's army of 100,000 men. Lee's army had fought a heroic defense, but by April of 1865, just 16 miles southwest of Petersburg, Grant's troops broke through Lee's defensive line. The Union forces overran the Southern lines at almost every point. Eventually, Lee and the Confederate government were forced to abandon their defenses at both Petersburg and the Confederate capital, Richmond. The Confederates burned their arsenals and warehouses to prevent the Yankees from getting guns and supplies. When the Union troops marched into Richmond, the city was battered and blackened. Out in the field, General Lee's half-starved Confederates struggled to maintain a fighting position until, finally, they were surrounded by Grant's army. Graciously, General Lee accepted General Grant's terms of surrender on April 9, 1865, at the small village called Appomattox Courthouse. The official document of surrender was signed on April 18, 1865. The surrender of Lee's army signaled the end of the Confederacy. On April 26, Confederate Commander Joseph Johnston and his 37,000 Confederates surrendered to General Sherman. Within a month, other Confederate generals, Taylor and Smith, had surrendered their troops. By May 26, 1865, the war was officially over. A total of almost 175,000 Confederates had laid down their arms. After 4 terrible years of war for both sides, the loss of 600,000 lives, an expense approximated at $10 billion, and the hopeless tragedy of destroyed homes, farms, and families, the defeated Southern states returned to the Union. Many Americans on both sides had fought and died for what they believed was right. Was the cost of the American Civil War worth it? Though the greatest struggles for the many black Americans to obtain true liberty lay in the years after the war. The war brought an end to the institution of slavery in the United States, and for many Americans, that was enough justification for the war. For most Americans, the Civil War also tested the strength of the American people to keep this nation under one government and prove their ability to preserve the Constitution of the United States of America.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He has trampled out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fitful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory.